While all the headlines out of this year's CinemaCon were all about Warner Brothers showing The Flash to assembled press and exhibitors, it wasn't the only screening of a movie that studios were hot on. Disney actually used the event to give us all a look at The Boogeyman, a horror flick by director Rob Savage of Dashcam and Host fame, which was originally set for Hulu, being a 20th Century Studios production. The movie turned out so well and was received so positively at test screenings that the studio is pivoting to a theatrical release, given how well recent movies that nearly went to streaming have done, including Smile and the studio's own Barbarian. While The Boogeyman, which is based on the Stephen King short story, is ultimately too mild to become a cult classic like Barbarian or a viral sensation like Smile, it's still an effectively made PG-13 horror movie anchored by some likable performances. The short story itself is used merely as a jumping-off point, with A Quiet Place writers Scott Beck and Brian Woods, along with Mark Heyman, building out the concept that a grieving family is haunted by an evil entity that preys on the suffering of others. Their horror movie delves deeply into grief. If you like the short story, well, it's acknowledged here with David Dastmalchian playing the story's Lester Billings, albeit a much more likable version who, unlike his counterpart on the page, isn't racist or homophobic. As in the short story, he tells his psychiatrist about how his children died mysteriously, and the premise of the film is that he passes on his family curse, that of the malevolent boogeyman, to Chris Messina's psychiatrist Will Harper, who just lost his wife in an accident. The movie is centered around Yellow Jacket's Sophie Thatcher, who plays his oldest daughter Sadie, who becomes a de facto surrogate parent to her younger sister Sawyer, played by Obi-Wan Kenobi's Vivian Lyra Blair. While Will is a psychiatrist, he's completely shut himself off emotionally, leaving Sadie to pick up the pieces, and it's their grief that makes them susceptible to the titular boogeyman, who is a malevolent entity that seems primed to kick off a new franchise for 20th Century Studios. While the PG-13 definitely means you shouldn't expect any huge gory shocks, director Rob Savage still manages to build a fair amount of tension. One thing he does, which I think is commendable, is that he avoids too many cheap jump scares, which is a tactic far too many modern horror movie directors rely on. While that might make the film feel a little bit low-key to some, he has enough faith in his material and actors to give the film an all-around classier feel. It definitely feels like it was conceived for theaters, with it well shot by Eli Bourne, who was also the DP on Hulu's Hellraiser. It's dark, but not in an overly oppressive way, meaning you can actually see what's going on, when they want you to, that is. If it ultimately lacks a lot of big scares, it makes up for it with the acting. While Chris Messina's part feels ultimately too passive and wishy-washy, at least until the final act, Thatcher does a really good job carrying her first big movie. Like on Yellow Jackets, she's empathetic and stretches a bit. On that show, she's a rebel, but here she's just a nice girl trying to do the best of her family. But out of necessity, she has to become a badass. The strongest aspect is her maternal relationship with her younger sister Sawyer, and her devotion to her sibling makes her a character you can root for. Marin Ireland also has a good role as Lester's wife, who's been left to tangle with the boogeyman on her own, and is the one Sawyer has to turn to for help. Dastmalchian's role is small, but it's a good against type piece of casting for him. Based on the fact that he almost always plays bad guys, you expect Lester to be a red herring, but ultimately he's quite sympathetic. In the end, The Boogeyman is a perfectly serviceable horror movie geared mostly at a teen audience. While it's probably too mild to really appeal to hardcore horror fans, it seems primed to do pretty big business and could indeed kick off a franchise. If you like horror on the lower key side, this is worth checking out in theaters, and I give it about a 6 out of 10. I wasn't all that scared by it, but I was fairly entertained by it.